Ronan Jones will be our first young author today, and Ronan's talk is Innovative Geophysical Application for Bridge Foundation Design and Construction.
How's it going? My name is Ronan Jones with Foundation Testing and Consulting. My talk is about seismic refraction case studies and correlation with PDA plan tip. And so as an introduction, about a year ago, I started working with my dad to create the PileTrack database. Now this is taking the PDA testing records from FTC, and then this is turning it into a data set of the PDA records. And Kyle Halverson with KDOT is going to be giving a presentation about how they're applying that inside of KDOT on Thursday. And in reviewing these data sets, we're starting to realize, there's a lot of jobs where there's significant underrun or overrun. And so if this is something that you're experiencing, I want you to think about, what are the ways that you're trying to combat this? And so in attending in June of 2022, I attended the SuperPile conference, and that got me thinking about perhaps implementing a method, seismic geophysics, to supplement the subsurface investigation to better predict where the pile is going to end up on these jobs. And so we identified, a lot of these jobs, the subsurface investigation was inadequate, and it was leading to a lot of problems. And so that's when we decided to try and use seismic refraction, and we spoke to Gretchen Schmauder with Geometrics at the 2022 SuperPile conference, and they supplied us, after hearing what we were going to do, they were interested and gave us a 3-week loan to perform seismic refraction throughout Kansas. And so some of the observations with current methods of investigation and these borings is there's access issues. You're not able to get borings where you want it. On some jobs, the nearest boring is going to be several feet away from the first pile-supported substructure. And this leads to a lot of problems. There's also, especially on end-bearing steel piles, there's insufficient rock coring. If you have a pile that's going to rock, sometimes the best boring is terminated before it hits rock, and so you're doing that investigation during construction. And so another issue is inflated SPT blow counts. You have materials such as gravel or cobble being logged as competent rock, and that leads to a lot of issues. And so as an overview of seismic refraction, the 24-channel geoseismograph that we were using, we lay out an array of geophones, and we introduced a compression wave, but we used a 16-pound sledgehammer combined with Olson Engineering strike plate. And then it logs the time that it takes between when the compression wave was introduced with the sledgehammer and then when it's recorded by the geophones. And then you can process it and compute what's the compression wave velocity of the various zones. And so on this slide, you'll see what one of these layered models looks like. And so, here we're getting adequate resolution to the depths that we want. I believe this pile ran about 35 feet into that 7,000 feet per second compression wave velocity. And so we're getting resolution significantly past planned depths, and that's really what we were after going into the study. And so as an overview, we surveyed 18 sites in 3 weeks. This included things like road cuts to assess rippability. A few sites were supplied by KDOT because they were interested in what we were doing, so that they gave us some sites to survey. The data analytics that I'll show later focuses on 8 of those sites. Those 8 sites all have PDA ground truth from historical foundation testing records. These are all end-bearing steel piles. And so some of the questions that we wanted to answer in our study is, how well does seismic refraction predict pile tips in various geology? What insights come from our case studies? And what are the implications for geophysics and bridge site characterization? And I didn't cover this earlier, but part of the reason we wanted to choose seismic refraction is, it was easy for us to process, and also it could be deployed with a two-man crew. And so that's really what allowed us to have such a ambitious initial study and try to survey 18 sites. And so some of the key findings from this initial study is we found a clear correlation between the seismic compression, the compression wave velocities and the PDA data. So what we were looking for is we wanted to see, if the pile tips out at a compression wave velocity of this, does that equate to having required pile capacity? Because I believe this is really the first instance of it, of trying to use seismic refraction for this. Yesterday at the FHWA talk, they were talking about, the A game and improving your investigation method, but these aren't new methods, these are just underutilized methods. But I think this is a novel, a new way of utilizing it to try and, say that in absolute compression wave velocity, this is where it's going to end up, rather than just using compression wave velocities to characterize, what's rock. And so we found this to be effective across various geological contexts in Kansas. The 8 sets that we narrowed it down to are all mostly gonna represent with the weathered shale profile. And we found this to be effective in improving the subsurface investigation and leading to more accurate pile depth prediction. And so I created this in Tableau. On the bottom axis, you'll see the required pile capacity. This varies anywhere from around 100 kips to 250 kips. And you'll see that though the required capacity varies a little bit, the compression wave velocity at the pile tip doesn't. It's right around 7,000 feet per second. And so here's another plot. This is showing the depth from the start of the PDA to when the PDA was terminated and pile capacity was met. On the far left, you'll see a job site where the PDA starts at a compression wave velocity of 8,000 feet per second. This represents getting into a limestone layer, and you'll see at 8,000 feet per second, you're only going to go a couple inches until you get your capacity and stop the PDA. Now on the right side of that, you see this job actually, this is in tilt, and it didn't reach bedrock. And the PDA started at a compression wave velocity about 2,500 feet per second, and that extended about 40 feet until capacity was met. That's also on this plot. Capacity was met at a compression wave velocity of 5,500 feet per second. So even though it didn't get into bedrock, it still got its capacity. It just had to go significantly longer. And in the middle of this plot, you'll see the middle of this plot represents a highly weathered shale profile. That's going to extend about 15 feet until you reach your capacity. So it really shows the compression wave velocity as like a function of depth. And so here's another job. So FTC was contacted by King Construction prior to construction on a bridge site in Wichita, and we were contacted to perform PDA, and we were looking at this job, and we thought that the pile might significantly underrun. And we had already finished our initial study of the 18 sites, and we felt confident in utilizing seismic refraction in order to maybe predict more accurately where these piles are going to end up. And so to confirm that suspicion, it was our first paying gig to perform seismic refraction, and we realized that these piles can be shortened up about 10 feet. And there's several hundred pile on that job. And that ended up being a savings of about 1,300 lineal feet of piling. All the pile installations ended up within a couple feet of where we predicted versus 10 feet. We surveyed 3 of the 6 substructures. We were looking, this is one line we laid out on a bike path using Google Earth. And we were really trying to confirm if there's any significant bedrock topography. And we found the bedrock to be around the same depths and we found that the 7,000 feet per second compression wave velocity that we decided the pile was likely going to tip out at was at roughly the same depth. And so some implications of this, there's the ability to reduce costs. That contractor, Jordan Toogood, he saved about $60,000 on that job, and it's especially important to note that the city of Wichita doesn't pay for cutoffs. And so all of these costs are going directly against the contractor. And there's also a significant environmental impact. You're saving 1,300 lineal feet of piling. That represents about 60 tons in CO2 emissions. And to contextualize that, that's the equivalent of what a family of 4 produces in a year. And so, there's an opportunity to integrate seismic refraction into standard practices, supplementing, current methods of investigation. And, while it might not seem like it makes sense on a smaller job, where you're spending maybe 10 to 20 grand on borings, it might make sense if you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on piling. So if you could spend $7,000 and get a seismic refraction survey and more accurately predict that, then you're likely to already have been saving more money than that. Not to mention the labor costs, having to mobilize, say there was an overrun on a job, you might need to mobilize more pile. That could lead to more delays and significant costs. There's more applications across bridge construction. Again, they were talking about it yesterday in the geophysics workshop. But at least in the Midwest where we're based out of, it seems like seismic geophysics as a whole is underutilized. I know KDOT has their own system now, and they're going to start implementing that. But I think there's an opportunity to do this to more accurately produce site classifications, to assess rock rippability, and more importantly, to more accurately predict the pile depths. And so some opportunities for future research. In our data set, it's only really represented, end-bearing H piles, and we produce compression wave velocities where we think that's going to end up. But not represented is friction piles, and I think it would be interesting to see how piles in different geologies in different states perhaps, what correlation with that might look like with PDA results. Also, time-dependent capacity changes. If you could say that at the end of initial drive you have this capacity and the pile tip is in this compression wave velocity zone, in 5 days are you likely to get your required capacity? Also, drilled shafts, predicting where the rock socket's going to be and in the installed casing depths. I think that could be very important. So to conclude, seismic refraction it proved to be a valuable asset in predicting the pile depth, and it's viable to incorporate along with the current standard practices with subsurface investigation. I'd like to point to the FTC YouTube channel. There's several videos talking about some of the specific case studies, 10 to 20 minute long videos about this. And I'd also like to thank Gretchen Schmauer with Geometrics. I don't think they made it out here, but really last year I had freshly turned 15 when I was attending the conference, and she treated me as a young professional and supplied us with the gear for the study, and I really appreciate that. So I'm ending about 6 minutes early, it looks like, but I'd like to open up for questions if you have any. Otherwise, you can meet us at the booth.
Any questions? We do have a couple minutes. Dave?
Ronan, you were looking at seismic refraction.
Right.
Did you consider any other techniques, or was this the only technique you were looking at, or is this after an evaluation of other seismic methods or other different types of geophysics as well?
Right, so as far as what led to us choosing seismic refraction over some other methods for our study, there's various types of analysis we could have done on that data. We found that just producing, the compression wave velocity model, to be effective because we were trying to survey so many sites, and it got us adequate resolution. So we tried doing MASW passive, and it just took too much time as far as producing the models afterwards. And we were also looking at some other, maybe like downhole seismic, but those methods just took too much resources to mobilize that, and also we were looking back on already constructed jobs, and we were able to perform this survey with a 2-man crew, and that's kind of why we chose it.
So I don't know if you all will when Ronan said that at the end, I was doing the math. So Ronan can be a young author for 20 more years. That's pretty cool. We're in good hands.